Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to cover a topic I've actually been very hesitant to cover simply because the Microsoft documentation and materials are so good. I really didn't think it was required, but a lot of people have pinged me asking me to kind of give an overview. So in this video I'm just going to provide a 360 overview of Azure Landing Zones. As always, if this is useful, a like, subscribe, comment and share is appreciated, and hit that bell icon to be notified when I release new content or do a live session. Now, the cloud has a huge number of services, really covering the entire gambit of anything I might want. And it's really easy to provision them. Click, click, click. Hey, I've got this resource stood up. But that may not be the right thing for an organization. Am I deploying in a secure way? Am I deploying in a scalable way? Am I meeting my organization's or regulatory requirements? Am I deploying highly available? Am I cost optimized? Am I reinventing the wheel? How will IT operate this? Am I using the right tools? Because maybe what I use on-prem, maybe there's a cloud native version I want to be leveraging. Am I following best practices? Is this cost optimized? The list goes on. There's a whole set of things we need to think about. We think about governance. We talk about best practices. I have a whole module on this in the Azure Masterclass. Now, there's a lot of documentation about best practices, about governance, about how to structure a good set of components in Azure where I can land my applications, my business applications. There are different capabilities on how I can deploy configurations onto an environment. And ideally what we want is, yes, documentation is great and we should know that documentation, we should read that. That's the whole idea around kind of the cloud adoption framework, which is phenomenal. But would it be really nice if there were some configurations I could take as a starting point? Maybe as a small business just to get maybe core policy and some core structure, maybe as a bigger enterprise, the right foundation on what I actually want to build for my applications. Well, that's what Azure Landing Zones are as part of the cloud adoption framework. Now, again, the documentation is amazing. So I'm not going to go into a deep dive about exactly all of the different components. Instead, I'm really going to focus on, well, what they are, and in a certain aspect, how they work and how we might actually want to use them. Now, before I do that, I do want to cover a few core concepts because they're what's going to be used by the Azure Landing Zones. Now, we can always think about, at a very core basic level, we have really an Azure subscription. Now, I might have multiple subscriptions. It comes down to my size, but I can think about, hey, I've got other subscriptions that I use within my organization. And I can think of a subscription as a container for resources. It is a boundary for certain types of things, like a virtual network cannot span subscriptions. But into this, I'm actually going to place resources. Now, the nice thing about subscriptions is I can apply things like policy, role-based access control, even budgets, controlling certain types of spending. I'm going to go into some more details about these things. But we have these subscriptions. Now, as a larger organization, potentially, I may also kind of have the idea of a kind of an enterprise agreement as part of an enterprise enrollment. So this construct that lets me have multiple subscriptions. There are things like account owners that can create subscriptions, but I get this rolled up billing mechanism within my organization. Now, within a subscription, we actually have the idea of, well, I can create resource groups. So I can create one or more resource groups. And once again, the whole point is I would have one or more. So I've got other resource groups. I can't nest them, but I have these resource groups. Now, once again, I can apply things like that policy, the RBAC, and even kind of those budgets. And the whole point of a resource group is it's things that share a common life cycle. They're going to get created together, they run together, maybe get deprovisioned together. So maybe it's a particular application, or maybe it's some kind of workload. For example, maybe it's my networking, maybe it's my connectivity. So these things that I place inside a particular resource group share kind of this common life cycle from birth to running to ultimate decommission. Now the whole point is a resource group is not a boundary of use. I could absolutely have my app in here, I could have virtual networks in here, I could have connectivity and key vault. I can spread those things around. The reason we like resource groups is I can use them as part of my governance, different policies. An application is likely going to have the same set of people needing permissions on all of the types of objects, because I can have things like, hey, I'll have maybe a VM, maybe a storage account, maybe a SQL database, maybe a load balancer. I want the same set of permissions, so that's nice to apply at that resource group level. I can then, when I start to think about, well, I have requirements about, hey, I'm saying RBAC, role-based access control, the ability to give a role, which is a set of actions, to something, a user, a service principal, managed identity at a certain scope. Scope could be a subscription, scope could be a resource group. So we have this Azure AD. So I can think about our organization is going to have an Azure AD instance. This may and likely will synchronize from on-premises Active Directory using Azure AD Connect or Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync. And in there, I have all these different types of objects. I think about, well, hey, yeah, I have the users. Again, they might be replicating from AD or they might be cloud. I might have service principals for my various applications. I might have things like managed identities, identities for cloud native in Azure that is just inherent and automatically managed for me. I may even have guests. Objects from other Azure AD tenants or Microsoft accounts or Gmail accounts or even Facebook, different ways I can do that. And I might kind of then have groups in which I can add all these various things into it. So they're identity objects I can use. So I have subscriptions, I have this identity. And this policy and RBAC, these are all great things, but maybe I have lots of subscriptions and I don't want to have to apply policy and RBAC to every single subscription, stamping those down. So what we then have is really this concept of kind of management groups. And as the name really suggests, it's the ability to group objects, my subscriptions together for the purpose of management. So you're going to have this root management group under your tenant, and then I can create different management groups to meet my needs. Maybe this is kind of a production management group, and ultimately under there I can have a whole set of hierarchies. I can nest these management groups. And then I have my production subscriptions, for example. Maybe I have dev, maybe it's based on business unit. I can have different purposes for this. But the whole idea is with these management groups, once again, I can apply those same kind of, hey, I have the idea of policy. I have the idea of role-based access control. And I have the idea of kind of these budgets. So I have all of these constructs available to me. And they inherit. So all of these things, no matter what level I kind of apply it to, these do get inherited down. So if I applied some policy at the root or at production, it would get inherited to child management groups and the subscription, the resource group, and ultimately the resource inside, which is probably what I kind of care about the most. So we have these great concepts to light all these things up. Now I've used the term RBAC a whole bunch of times. So the whole point of role-based access control is it is that ability to have roles. Remember, a role is just really a set of actions for the different resource providers in Azure, assigned to some kind of identity, assigned at a certain scope. So I can say I want to give this group or this service principal this role at production management group, or at this subscription, or at this resource group, or even this resource. And then we have the idea that on premises, there are things we have to stick to, maybe where I can create public IPs, maybe what types of service, what types of resiliency we want. And that's enacted by IT operations. Hey, I as a developer want a resource, please create this for me. They make sure it meets requirements, and then they only create it if it does. I can't do that in the cloud. So in the cloud, we use policy. So we have Azure policy, and that is our guardrails. There's a huge number of these Azure policies that are just built in. I can create my own. Then I can do things like restrict what regions I use, what VM SKUs I use, what types of storage account I use. Do I have Azure Site Recovery deployed? Am I using Azure Key Vault? Mass numbers of these Azure policies. Do I want to use tagging, important metadata that I can use to think about, hey, what is the purpose of this resource? Maybe cost centers. I can control all of that with policy. So I can think about policy as being a way to both enforce my requirements. I could deny, I can have an effective deny if it doesn't meet, or I can use it for audit. It can even remediate, kind of deploy if not exists. So I have these different capabilities, but these are my guardrails. And when I'm starting out in Azure, a key thing really is to get that policy the right way. And again, we'll see some of these policies a little bit later on. And that can be tricky. Like, what policies should I be using? I drew these resources, and I kind of drew a VM, and I drew a storage account, and I said clickety click click. It may not exactly sound like that way, but we don't really want to create resources that way. If I just create from the portal, well, I'm not creating in a consistent manner. It's not easily repeatable. I can't really track for drift. So we like infrastructure as code, the ability to describe that infrastructure, those resources, as human readable code. Now, the native way to do that in Azure is we have this concept of an Azure Resource Manager template. And what I can absolutely have is I can think about, well, I can create, let's go up a second, my ARM, it's a JSON format template. Now, over time, you might see these start to migrate to Bicep. Bicep is this new domain-specific language that's far more human-friendly. But for now, these are JSON templates. And the reason we like these are they are declarative, which means I'm not telling it how to do something. I'm telling it what I want to be there. Hey, I want a storage account that's LRS in this region. Make it so. It's its job to go and look at what's there, and does it match my configuration, or does it need to go and create, or does it need to modify? Which means these are also idempotent. That simply means I can rerun this thing as many times as I want. It won't have an effect. If the resource is there and it matches how it's described in this template, great. If it isn't, hey, it will make it so and modify it. So this is super powerful because I can almost just rerun this. I can use it to detect drift. Hey, this is what I want. What's there? Hey, this is what would be changed. And so ideally, when we create resources, I really want to create these resources using a template. So we use those ARM JSON templates to actually create things. So now I can also use it with things like Git, so I can version control. I can see the changes I make between my versions. Now, speaking of resources, there are a huge number of different resources available. But there are some key ones I'm really going to always want. For example, I can think about what are some of the key things, like a log analytics workspace. I want that deployed. I want things like Azure Security Center deployed. I want those things. I'm probably going to have a virtual network within my subscription. But then I might have more organizational wide resources. So yeah, I have a local VNet, but I might have maybe things like virtual WAN to govern that overall set of networking for the company. And these become spokes off of that virtual WAN. This would have my express route, my site-to-site VPN, whatever I need, my Azure firewall. Or maybe I don't use vWAN, but I still need a kind of connectivity hub, which would have express route gateway and or site-to-site VPN and or Azure firewall. So I'm probably going to have those more centralized set of resources. I might also have things like, well, Azure Key Vault. I might have a central Azure Key Vault in a certain subscription. I mean, really the list goes on. I might be migrating resources. Hey, I'll have an Azure Migrate instance. So we also have these key sets of resources I want. Now, I've talked about a lot of different things. I've not even talked about landing zones yet. And the reason is landing zones really are going to do this work for me. That's the whole point. You need to understand what the constructs are, because all of these decisions, when I'm saying, well, yeah, there are policies, yeah, you need some of those, and hey, you want to structure things a certain way, that's the hard part, is knowing what ones to use, and landing zones do that for me. Now, before we look at landing zones, I want to cover one other construct in Azure. I'm running out of colors here, so we'll pick, I don't know, I'll do yellow, may not show that well. We'll see. Actually, yeah. And it's an Azure Blueprint. So I can think about, I have this Azure, I'm just going to call it Blueprint. If I thought about some of the types of resource I've mentioned, resource groups as a way to bring things that have a common life cycle, well, I can define resource groups within blueprints. I can have multiple resource groups. I can specify, hey, policies I want. So I can absolutely include in here, hey, at this resource group, I want this policy. Or maybe it's just at the root subscription. I want this policy. Role-based access control, I can add those things as well. So I could add kind of an RBAC over here. These ARM templates that I have, hey, guess what? I can specify ARM templates. So I can say, hey, yeah, I want this particular template deployed to this resource group. Maybe I'm deploying a different template under this resource group. And the whole point of this is, once I've got these blueprints that bring together these core types of structure, hey, well, I can just take that and essentially assign it to a subscription, which is going to stamp down that configuration, onto that particular subscription. So that blueprint can encompass all of these different constructs together to just make it reality, deploy it onto the subscription. Now note, when we talk about Azure Landing Zones, ideally we're using them on empty subscriptions. We're just kind of stamping this out greenfield. But if you have an existing subscription with existing resources in it, they're going to work with those brownfield scenarios as well, so you don't have to worry. So we have all these fundamentals down. Again, there are quite a few of them. But the key point is, this is what Azure Landing Zones are literally going to use. Now, there are a number of different Azure Landing Zones, really depending on, do we want to start small, i.e., hey, I'm focusing really on a subscription. I want to get the basic constructs, maybe some key policies in place. And then I want to deploy my application into that. Or am I thinking enterprise? Hey, I want to get all of the things in place for maybe my enterprise. I want to have connectivity, maybe with vWAN. Maybe it's a more hub and spoke where I'll use, not using vWAN, but I'm setting up an express route gateway or a site-to-site VPN. Maybe I want to integrate with Azure DevOps. I might have all these different options. There's a whole set of different landing zones that I select. And that's the point. As a company, I can choose to kind of start small and grow, or I can just, hey, I'm going to go to one of these enterprise, or I might, yeah, I'll use the start small and then I'll move to the enterprise in the future. I do recommend reading the documentation. So if we go and look at the landing zone implementation options, firstly, on this left-hand side, you'll see there's a mass of documentations. This is all part of the Cloud Adoption Framework. And I'm really going and looking at these Azure Landing Zone section over here. And I'm just focusing on the implementation options. But again, the documentation is fantastic. I can see what is a landing zone. It's got a nice little video about it. It talks about the key design areas. Remember, I talked about a lot of these in my little picture, but it's going through those different elements. How do I pick what landing zone I should actually use? And they're talking about here, look, hey, I can start small and expand, or I can just go straight into enterprise scale. And it talks about, well, what are the decision criterias I might use? What are my initial considerations? But I'm going to look at the implementation options. And what we can see here is there's fundamentally two when I think about starting small. And these actually can build on each other. Because what we have here is this Cloud Foundation Blueprint. Now, if we look at this Cloud Foundation Blueprint, it talks about its design principles, the deployment options, the different resource, the governance, all of these different things. But what we can just jump over to is, hey, look, let's deploy the blueprint sample. So this is actually deploying how I can use this. It gives me all the different instructions. And remember I talked about those blueprint things. Well, this is because it's just native part of blueprints. Now I can go and look at a nice picture of what this is actually going to do. And we can see here, well, it's using kind of an Azure Active Directory, and it's going to go and deploy Key Vault, Log Analytics. See, it's got storage accounts. It's using Azure Policy, Azure Security Center. So, okay, it's going to go and deploy these things for me. So if we actually now just jump over to my Azure subscription, I can just go and look at blueprints. And I'm going to my blueprint definitions over here on the left. And if I select this, I want to create a new blueprint. Now they're providing templates, but I'm going to create my own blueprint because I could modify this. And if I just search for CAF, that's the Cloud Adoption Framework, and I can see the Foundation and Migration Landing Zone. So I'm going to start with Foundation. Now I'm going to give it a name. Give it something useful in your way. So maybe it would be my, I might say Savile Tech Blueprint CAF Foundation. Now the definition is going to store it somewhere, and then I can assign it at a different scope. So I might choose to store it in my management groups. Optionally, I could pick a subscription. I don't need to. But then I can see all of the artifacts. Now remember I talked about artifacts. I could have things like role-based access control. We had all these different types of things that I could have. Policies, RBAC, templates, actually creating resource group. So the artifacts we're actually seeing in the portal is using those things. So we jump back over, I can see, well, at the subscription level, it's deploying a whole bunch of policies. We can see the artifact type, and these are doing policy assignments. Okay, so we're going to deploy a cost center tag to resource groups. We're going to apply a cost center tag and its value from the resource group. Enable Azure Security Center. We're specifying allowed locations for resources. So I'm going to pick, hey, I only want to deploy to East US 2 maybe and West US 2. I want Network Watcher for virtual networks. Resource types I don't want in my environment. Secure transfer to storage accounts should be enabled, so I can't just use a non-secure way. Restricting what type of storage account. Restricting what type of VMs. And then we're deploying, here we can see we're actually deploying a template. So we're actually deploying Azure Security Center. And then it's creating a resource group for shared services. Remember, this is a simple deployment. So the Key Vault, my Log Analytics is still in the same subscription, but we're going to put it in a different resource group. So it's going to create a resource group for shared services, and then into there, create a Key Vault using a template, and then create a Log Analytics workspace using a template. And then it's creating resource groups for network, identity service, and my first application, because each app should go to its own resource group, just to put me on my way for good practices. So it's going to lay those things down. Now you'll notice a lot of these have parameters. Some of them are populated, some of them are not. So when I actually went to deploy this, assign it to a subscription, I will have to tell it those various parameters. For example, which storage account SKUs am I going to allow? Maybe I don't want LRS, I want everything GRS, so I have that resiliency cross-region. Maybe I only want certain types of virtual machines. So basically, I would now save this draft, then I would publish it, then I could assign it. And at the point of assignment, well, that's when it would actually stamp that down. Now, an important point, what we're really doing here is we're getting these things stood up, we're getting started, we're kind of learning these things. These are very modular. So when I think about this, when I do an assignment of a blueprint, we actually have locking options. So with a locking option, I could say things like, hey, it's read-only. I can't change at the control plane anything about it, which will be bad for a lot of things like a virtual network. I couldn't create new subnets. I can say, hey, it's do not delete, or I can say don't lock. Most of the time, because of the way we're using these blueprints for landing zones, that assignment is going to be don't lock. They're very modular. We're learning, we're iterating. I don't need to do the locking. This is really all about getting these things laid down, getting that good structure. We're going to build on that in the future. So I don't need to really lock those things. So when we do the assignment, hey, I can just say don't lock. That was one of them. Now, additionally, we saw there was one for Azure Migrate. Now, if I look at the create a blueprint, once again, we'll go to the CAF, migration landing zone. Once again, I'm not really going to fill this in because I just want to get to the details of it. If we look at the artifacts this time, we can see, well, there's this deploy Key Vault for log analytics and Key Vault, deploy a VNet landing zone to bring resources into, but deploy Azure Migrate. This is not deploying any policies this time. And remember, the reason for this is modular. The way I would use this is I really think about, hey, I've already deployed that foundational one. This is idempotent, so that deploy Key Vault, deploy log analytics, well, it would already be there. It won't deploy again. But it will deploy the virtual network landing zone, and it will deploy the Azure Migrate. So I can have these build on, they're modules. So when I thought about my picture and I drew a blueprint, well, definitely, yes, I'll deploy that foundational one. And then I say, hey, I want to do migrations. I could then deploy also the migration blueprint. Again, I'm not locking it to the same subscription. So then I'm adding on those additional services to it. And that's really the key point for those small scale. I can build on them. I should also point out, so I'm showing you the blueprint model. There is also, if I just quickly find the link, there is a Terraform version of this. So if we jump back over to our portal over here, and we'll actually go to our landing zone implementation options. So great, these were the start small, but if we keep scrolling down, there's another start small. And this is Terraform. So this will actually, if you're an organization that's maybe using multiple clouds, maybe I'm using on-premises, VMware and Kubernetes and Hyper-V, I really don't want to use the blueprints. I'm using Terraform already. I want to carry on using that. Well, there's a whole set of Terraform modules I can use. I can go to the Terraform registry, and it's really doing very similar things, but it's a whole bunch of different Terraform files to actually do those deployments. So I can use that Terraform landing zone instead. So if that's my model, great, go ahead. I can absolutely use my Terraform instead. So I get that choice. So that's the small scale. That makes sense. And we could kind of see, actually, if we look back at the documentation for a second, if we scroll up, it has these kind of design principles. And if we click that, again, it does show us really what that's doing. I've got these kind of baselines. But if we actually go and look at the blueprint picture of that actual one, over here, it's showing us that architecture. This is exactly what it's deploying, and it's going through the different policies that it's actually giving us so we can understand what we're getting. So it's laying down really that core foundation that we want to use. Perfect. What about if we're not small scale? What about if we're a larger organization and I want to start enterprise ready? Now, if I'm enterprise ready, I'm not going to deploy everything into one subscription. I'm probably going to have the idea of a set of shared services and then separate things for my applications. Also, because now we're going to be dealing with multiple subscriptions, we're not going to use blueprints anymore. We're shifting. So the small scale, they use a blueprint. It's just in the portal, I can stamp that down. For the enterprise scale, remember these ARM templates? Well, ARM templates actually don't have to only deploy resources into a resource group. I can actually do ARM templates that deploy resource level to actually grow and create resource groups, subscription level things. I can really deploy everything through a resource group. So these enterprise scale will actually use ARM templates to create the entire structure. Now, once again, there's different options here. So once again, if we go and look at the documentation, there's really three things we're dealing with here. We'll see we have this CAF Enterprise Scale Landing Zone. And we can see all of the details around this in a second. But really, there's two variants of this. We have a variant that adds in hybrid connectivity using virtual WAN. So we have this. Because the just regular enterprise scale landing zone assumes everything's in Azure. It's not dealing with any connectivity to on-premises. So this enterprise scale landing zone with virtual WAN adds in virtual WAN to give me that hybrid connectivity. The vWAN has functionality to do express route and site-to-site VPN and spoke-to-spoke communications through Azure Firewall. It does all these marvelous things. Or I want hybrid connectivity, but I don't want to do it through vWAN. I just want to have regular gateways. Well, then I can use this option. And what's interesting about these are all templates. They're not using blueprints, but they actually have a custom UI in the portal when you deploy them that lets you select, well, which bits you want. For example, things like Azure DevOps is optional. I don't have to deploy it. So let's actually look for a second. And if we actually go and let's start with the design principles over here. So this is talking about the enterprise scale design principles. You want to quickly review this, but then it actually shows you the architecture. So this is the landing zone in enterprise scale. So it's focused around the idea that, yes, these network watchers and security center, keys, shared services, networking. Then it has this picture of high-level architecture. And it's huge. I mean, it's this gigantic picture that maybe looks fairly scary. And there's actually two fairly scary-looking pictures. But it's actually not as bad as it seems. What this is really showing, if we click on one of them, and I'll try and zoom in just a little bit, we can think about, well, it's talking about those enterprise enrollments that we covered in the past, like how I maybe do those billing. It's talking about, yes, there's kind of my Azure AD for my various identities. Maybe advanced, I am using things like PIM, just-in-time access, and various types of controls, conditional access, MFA. Then it talks about an entire management group structure you might want to use, that hierarchy I can have. And then it just breaks it down into, well, different subscriptions. And it's breaking it down into, well, an identity subscription where I have maybe domain controllers. I'm actually having domain controllers in Azure. We have management subscriptions. I have things like connectivity subscriptions. Can see if I scroll out for a second. My connectivity maybe has my virtual WAN hub because this is the vWAN option. Then I have my landing zone application 1, application 2. So they each have their own subscription and the core services that they use. Notice there's a load balancer, they have their own VNet applications, and it's peering into that connectivity subscription. And then maybe I have a sandbox subscription. And maybe completely optionally, we light up Azure DevOps. So this is the version that I'm using vWAN. The other picture is essentially exactly the same. The only difference here, notice I've got DevOps options, I've got management subscriptions, but I'm not using vWAN in the connectivity subscription anymore. It's just a hub VNet. And then I would say, well, yeah, I'm going to turn on Azure Firewall or ExpressRoute or VPN. But then I still have landing zone subscriptions for my application. I'm still using peering from my app subscription to get to that connectivity subscription. So it's really about how is it lighting up that hybrid connectivity? Is it using vWAN or am I really just manually doing things? Now from the main page, you'll actually notice, well, there's a deploy option. So if I actually hit deploy, it's taking me to the GitHub repo. It's showing me the enterprise scale foundation, and it's going to show me what it's doing. So it's showing me the management group structure it's going to use. It's then showing me the resources. So I've got an Azure subscription for management. Okay, a log analytics workspace, security center. Optionally, so I'm going to pick, do you want a sub for domain controllers? Optionally, do I want to add in GitHub? Then it's got these various Azure policies. And so these are the resources it's going to create for me. So it's showing me exactly what it's going to do. Now, if I deployed this and then later on decided, actually, I want to use vWAN or I want to add in that subscription for connectivity, I can manually do it. And at the bottom of the page, notice it's showing me, hey, look, when you deploy this through the portal, it's got this custom where I can pick the bits I want. But all the way at the bottom, I can actually get an ARM template that would add virtual WAN or add hub and spoke to this one I've already deployed, or it's telling me, hey, you can manually create them by following these steps. So it gives me that ability to grow in the future. But if we scroll all the way back up to the top of this, if we say deploy to Azure, hit that button, we're going to go to essentially a subscription, and then it's going to show me this custom UI to actually leverage and deploy that. So here's my enterprise scaling zone. I'm giving it a region to deploy to. I would have a company prefix. Now, this I want to be unique for my company. So maybe it will be Savile, MG, or whatever I'm going to pick there. I would have something there. Maybe I'll just do Savile Tech. And it's got that information. Again, this is unique at the tenant scope, max 10 characters. I think I spelled Savile Tech wrong because there we go. It's that kind of day. And then it's got all these questions. Hey, yes, I'm deploying log analytics. What's my retention going to be? What is my management subscription? I would pick the one I've created already. Which solutions do I want deployed? Do I want these other components added? I could then integrate with kind of DevOps. Again, I've not really picked anything for this. Landing zone configurations. I have all these different steps I can actually deploy as part of this. Now I can actually go and look at the template, and the template would show me all of the different things it's actually going to use. Now it's going to break the UI when I do that, if I change anything. But fundamentally what this is doing is there's a whole set of resources, and what these resources are actually doing are calling other templates. If I go back to the GitHub, now you don't really need to know this, but if I go up a level, well, I can see the ARM templates. So here's the foundation, here's adding vWAN, adding hub. And this foundation template is really just calling templates in this auxiliary folder that add the various components. Hey, Azure DevOps, Log Analytics, management groups, policies, all of those things are just being called to actually go and configure that all-up solution. So it's going to stamp down that configuration for me. And that's the key point. It's doing this structure, it's laying down this foundation. Now, as I mentioned, there are other versions. There's a version with virtual WAN. Now, once again, for the virtual WAN, I could just say, hey, I want to go and deploy that thing. It's going to show me the GitHub page for that. And now it's showing me what it is going to deploy. So notice here it's adding this connectivity subscription, where it's adding in virtual WAN. I can see that over here. It's going through all the different components, the management group structure, network topology of how it's going to work, huge amounts of detail. So if you're thinking about doing this, you really want to read through these pages. It gives you all of the detail you need, the management, the monitoring, all of the detail of what it's going to do. But once again, it's fundamentally just using ARM templates to deploy all of those various components. And once again, you can, if you want, kind of go and have a look at everything it's doing. And once again, it's calling these sub-templates to actually go and do the work. If you look at just the main B1 JSON file, you'll see it sets up a bunch of variables. If I can find the variable section, all these parameters. So then we have all of these variables, which are the deployment URLs, which are all those auxiliary templates that call the individual parts that do things. So it's just calling those to actually do the deployment. And likewise, there's the one with hybrid connectivity. And once again, if we look at that one, it has its own GitHub page. Once again, it goes through showing us the picture of this. Once again, this time it's showing us, hey, this connectivity subscription where I would go and add my own ExpressRoute gateway, my VPN gateway, and it will prompt you for that as it deploys. And once again, you can go and peek around. I can look at, hey, that main hub spoke. And once again, we can go and see the various templates it's going to use, hub spoke connectivity, to actually go and set all of these different things up. And that's really what we're doing here. I mean, that's the point of these landing zones. So landing zones, sure, on a small scale, start small, is creating a sub, putting some basic policies in place, some basic resource group structure, and then I can go and create my resources. The enterprise are actually stamping out a full kind of set of management groups. I get my subscriptions I need, the core services. It's going to ask me all those questions about things to really make it enterprise ready, a place to land my applications. There's now going to be a place for my applications to land. And if I then add the versions like the vWAN or the hybrid, there's a separate subscription with all my connectivity that will peer to my app subscription to give it that hybrid connectivity through. So that's the point of landing zones. It's a landing place for my applications that's following best practices around leveraging the cloud. Rather than me kind of struggling and creating stuff and then realize, well, that's not quite right, use the landing zones. Again, start small if you need to, and I can grow, and there's documentation in there for how to do that growth. Or I might stamp down one of those enterprise ones that, again, the picture looks way scarier than it really is. It's just stamping out some core services that put us in a great position to then grow and deploy my applications across different subscriptions. But it's putting those key constructs in place for me, and it's just going to help me get up and running without making those mistakes that tend to happen. It's going to put those best practices, those guardrails, that good foundation, which is all this is. Foundation of a house, they all have the kind of the same bits. We have rebar and concrete and pipes, but you might lay them out slightly differently, but then we build great stuff on top. This is putting the foundation down for Azure. That's what this is for. And that's it. So as always, hope this was useful. Look at the documentation, it's phenomenal. Don't forget about those pages to help me decide what I want to do. Good luck in using those Azure landing zones. Until next time, take care.